The Deep Range by Arthur C. Clarke. After a terrifying nightmare in outer space, Walter Franklin needed to discover a reason for living. He found it in the ocean depths when strangers defied death to give him life. Freedom to roam above and below the great waters should have been enough for any man, but Franklin was haunted by the memory of an echo that could solve the oldest mystery of the sea. So, a bit florid. This is going to be a longish review and it's going to be a bit ranty because I feel there's a lot to rant about in this book. I read this because I've felt a bit of a marine biology sci-fi theme happening there. I read David Brin's Star Tide Rising, and then I read Whale Song, which was not sci-fi but was definitely marine in orientation, and it was working for me, so I thought I'd give Arthur C. Clarke's The Deep Range a go. In hindsight, having read it, I'm sure that I've read this before. Maybe not all of it. I may have started it and not finished it because it's got issues. It definitely has issues. But I might even have finished it and just not remembered it too well. So this is a book in 3 sections. The first is The Apprentice, the second is The Warden, and the third is The Bureaucrat. The Apprentice is lyrical about the GBR, Great Barrier Reef, and tropical waters. And right from the first, this is a book that should be great. There's so much that's great about it. It's Arthur C. Clarke, so the writing is good. The marine themes are very vivid and very excellent and drew me in. And it is, the first part is at least partly set in Brisbane, where I used to live and which I know well. It's set around the bunker group of the Great Barrier Reef Islands, Lady Musgrave, Lady Elliot. It's the Capricornia as well. And the descriptions are vivid. I'd say Arthur C. Clarke, in his author's note, he mentions that he's been to Heron Island, which I'm incredibly jealous of, by the way. And it ought to have been really excellent. It was clear that Arthur C. Clarke really enjoyed the tropical waters. His descriptions of Heron Island make one think that he loved the tropical islands of the southern Great Barrier Reef. There is no reason why this shouldn't be a great book. Shoulda, coulda, woulda. Wasn't. At least for me, it definitely wasn't. So, all the good bits are really good, but there are some serious bad bits, and I mean seriously bad, and they wreck the reading experience exponentially for me. Maybe not for everyone, but for me. I like the fact that the author is lyrical about the beauty of the Pacific. It set my nerves on edge, visualizing the horrific future that Clarke envisaged for the Great Barrier Reef and the Pacific Ocean in general. So the marine part starts well. It gives us a taster of the notion of behind the book. There's a character called Don. He's a warden for... Never mind what he's a warden for. He's a warden and he's in this little sub and he's out there in the Pacific. There's been a break in the fence that keeps whales in toward the Great Barrier Reef, which is their natural migration anyway. We're talking about humpbacks here at the moment, by the way. There's been a break in the reef. There's escapees. He goes after them. He sees from is it radar they're using? From the imaging, that there's 4 blips. He thinks it's a whale being chased by sharks, but it turns out it's a female humpback with 2 calves, which is rare but not unheard of, and they're being chased by the most enormous great white. And he saves the humpback and her calves from the great white shark, which is a bit sad because he kills it. It's the biggest great white shark he's ever seen, but they kill it. Sad. But he saved the humpback and her calves, right? That's great. Hooray. Don's a hero. But then we realize on the downslide that he only did it because humans are farming humpbacks to slaughter for meat. So he saved them so they could be slaughtered and flinched later at the Georgian whaling station or somewhere else in the Antarctic, and I wanted to vomit. And this sensation persisted throughout the book. It was pass the bucket. Read a couple of set pages. Oh, pass that bucket over again, because the world building was almost so good. The misogyny was wince-worthy, but I could have borne with it if everything else in the book was good. The eco-terrorism that Clarke envisaged for the Pacific Ocean was horrific and made me very critical of everything in this book. So, on page 84, for example, where we've got this great moving scene where Don and his apprentice Franklin, who's the one that came from the stars and needed to discover a reason for being, which was saving whales for slaughter or whatever. They're employed by the World Food Organization, who has a whaling division, and the whaling division, oh look, never mind. Anyway, there's this great moving scene. Franklin's tried to commit suicide. Don't even think I'm bothering about spoilers in this junk fire. Franklin's tried to commit suicide. He escaped by in a really exciting way, actually, he escaped. Don surfaces him in a pod of migrating whales. It's great, it's moving, it's very impactful, sort of tingles at the emotions. It's meant to be cathartic. It probably is. It surfaces in the sub, surrounded by whales, all doing their migration. There's some of them breaching in the distance. It sounds amazing, until you remember that they are a captive meat source, an intelligent captive meat source, and Don and Franklin get to enjoy this vision because they are basically cowboys. Yeah, okay. So I had such issues with this book on so many levels. From the huge expenses that I envisaged from these submarines and the facilities and the whole whaling thing, I imagined that whale products were feeding all of humanity. No, they make up 12% of human food, and that is just ridiculously small for the amount of money that's being invested in it. And at one point they're flying over North Queensland, which at the moment, and back when Arthur C. Clarke would have visited Heron Island and Brisbane and the North Coast, it's all farms. That's all farmland. A lot of it's bananas and sugarcane, but there's lots of other types of farming as well. This book was published in 59. Is it 59? Copyright 57, published 59. It must be 59. I kept chanting 59, 1959 the whole time I read it. Okay, it was copyrighted 59. 57. Whatever. Anyway, so back in 57, there probably weren't quite as many farms on the North Queensland coast, but farming on the North Queensland coast, apparently in this book, no longer happens because man has started farming the seas. 1957, that's all I can say. Oh yes, and then he describes how no one will be happy until all the orcas were wiped out of the ocean because they target the humpbacks, who are our meat source. I'm past that bucket. And also the shark killing was through the roof, and in the 50s, I know in the 50s there was still no attempt at shark conservation, but these days we know that totally killing off the apex predators of the ocean, the sharks, is throwing everything out of balance. Not that it matters here where there's nothing approaching balance anywhere in the Pacific anymore. Okay, dated. Yes, this one has dated poorly. Arthur C. Clarke is a hit or miss. He can sometimes date really, really badly, and here he has dated really, really badly for me, personally. Maybe not for you, but for me. First of all, when is it set? Clarke is very coy within the book about what the timing of it is, and he is in some of his other books that I've read as well. We don't get a date. Early on, he mentions that it's 65, I think it's meant to be 65 years ahead of where he wrote it. But later on, someone mentions that it's 100 years after people stopped using sheepdogs. And as an Aussie, that just made me snort my tea with laughter. It's like, Australians aren't going to stop using sheepdogs. And they're not going to stop eating sheep either. I'm just going to tell you that now. Certainly not in favour of eating whale. New Zealand, Australia, huge amounts of Europe and the UK. Sheepdogs are an institution. They are part of life for a huge number of communities. And does Clark know nothing about sheepdogging? Look, just never mind. He probably doesn't. Whatever. Okay, on page 24. This really dated it early on. So we're in the stage. Don has been pulled from his regular duties, shepherding whales around in the Great Barrier Reef and the Pacific, to meet a strange, unidentified student, that's Franklin, and to bring him fast up to warden status. He doesn't go through the regular course. He gets a single tutor. He goes to Heron Island, lucky bastard, and gets taught how to become a warden. It's 2024, hasn't been for long, but it's 2024, and in this era of inclusiveness, we have to think what sort of a man would be contemptuous of someone for having a phobia of flying or heights. Well, Don is the person, and Don is meant to be a character we like and emphasize with. In actual fact, I did like and emphasize with Don in many ways. He was by far the most vivid, interesting character in this book. We are meant to be Team Don. He's a bit of a cowboy, but he's a good-natured, outgoing, friendly cowboy. On page 24, he looks down upon Franklin for having a phobia of flying or fear of heights. And we're meant to be Team Don, and right then I wasn't. Right then I was thinking, I do not like Don. Don is a dickhead. Don't be like Don. Don't torture people who have phobias of heights. By chapter 3, I thoroughly disliked Don. I changed after time, but for an early part, I couldn't enjoy the character who's meant to be your main gateway into this book and this world. Oh yeah, and then he started baiting Franklin for his fear of heights. Not always successfully, because Franklin's a fairly strong character, but nevertheless. Okay, dated. The notion that all agriculture is now sea-based. Very, very dated. Very 50s or earlier. Very, very wince-worthy in the way it's described. That in itself wouldn't have put me off this book, because speculative fiction is why I love sci-fi. I love the fact that Clark was trying to envisage a world in which things are different to the way they were in the 50s and going in a direction that they certainly weren't, and thank goodness they didn't. I didn't like his outcome though, and so I didn't enjoy that part. Okay, the notion. I think there was this part where he goes to Brisbane to meet Don, and he's talking about, they're still arguing about whether to air condition Brisbane, and he's not talking about individual buildings. He's talking about air conditioning the whole city, mall, streets, and all. And how funny is that? That was hysterically funny. I laughed at that too. Oh yes, another, dated in so many ways. On page 134, we have Franklin, who's doing a little bit of a passion project out in the ocean, and he's examining hundreds of feet of old-fashioned 16mm film, which is still unsurpassed in its own field as a recording medium. Oh, honey, that is so cute. That is so quaint. That made me giggle ever so much. And wait, hundreds of feet, 16mm film, feet and millimeters in the same sentence? Americans, sorry guys, you're weird. Gotta say. Okay, what else? Science fails. Okay, the casual slaughter of sharks, and every other sharks, but tiger sharks in particular. Some biologists knew better even in the 50s. You can't tell me that this was something that they didn't know. They already knew that sharks were necessary to the environment. later on we'll move into a different section, but we have a shark biologist, in fact the only woman in this whole book, Indra. She starts off as being a really interesting character. She's a shark biologist. She's doing a postdoctorate on vitamin levels in shark livers, and she's casually slaughtering one on the beach to chop bits out of its liver, and mentions that she slaughters several a week. That's a bit sad. She starts off as a pretty good character. She's a scientist. She's focused on her career. She's intelligent. She goes downhill after that, but yeah, she starts off well. On page 33, I had a little bit of a science fail over the fact that, I mean, Don isn't really a marine biologist, and Franklin is still a complete non-entity at that stage, but they're walking across this long jetty to reach the submarines, passing the reef flat, and they're not interested in the reef flat. That's terribly not interesting because they're about to go down. They know that all the good stuff is offshore. I don't know a single marine biologist who walks over a reef flat without looking at it. They're not uninteresting. They are the essence of what a tropical coral island is, and 33 just went, oh, please no. I mean, maybe Clark found one person on Heron Island that got snobby with him about it. I don't know. Okay, on page 34, oh, that was hysterical too. Okay. So Don and Franklin walk past this gorgeous reef flat, which they aren't interested in because they know it's better underneath, to get on underwater scooters. They call them torpedoes. I don't know if individual underwater scooters were allowed around the 50s. I feel that maybe they weren't. So well done envisaging that, Clark, if that's the case. But these scooters, they undress to get on them. They go underwater in swimming trunks and pullovers. Now, we're talking about underwater scooters. They're on them for at least an hour, because some way into this dive, they talk about going on for another 40 minutes. They're going down to a depth of about 30 meters. The water temperature in the bunker group ranges from 22 degrees centigrade to 30 degrees centigrade surface temperature. Surface temperature, not bottom temperature, certainly not 30 meters down. It's probably not the depth of summer anymore, so it won't be the 30 degrees because they were in Brisbane in the depths of summer, and it's a bit later. You go down, I'm a scuba diver, as you go down it gets colder. You don't scuba down for an hour in a swimsuit at 30 meters without getting hypothermia. At 22 degrees, hypothermia will have set in by 1 hour, to the extent of losing dexterity and mental acuity. So this dive was really funny to a scuba diver. I get that he was trying. In the 50s, scuba was in its inception stage, but this just made me laugh. Though I admit I really loved the groper that they go down to see. It may be borrowing from the groper that's on the Yongala. Anyway, this 30-meter fail in terms of temperature and hypothermia actually bothered me a heap more than the deep dive with 182 meters, I think, that happened later. Because that 182-meter dive wasn't described as normal. It wasn't described as routine. And the deepest free dive of record is, I think, 214 meters. Anyway, so that's not impossible. But the idea of someone routinely, as a workplace issue, diving, wearing budgie smugglers down to 30 meters, it's ludicrous. Sorry. Now, the idea of plankton farms in tropical waters, which meet the world's food needs. 1950s, I had to keep reciting to me. No one would do their book like that today, I hope. It's just not feasible for the tropical waters, even if you are setting off nuclear bombs to raise nutrients to the surface or whatever. It just isn't. And he talks about diatoms as part of the food source. You're not going to get a whole lot of nutrient from diatoms, let me tell you that. Okay, other fashion fails in the science region. Squids don't have flukes. What do you mean you lassoed the giant squid around the flukes? They don't have flukes. You're thinking of whales, Arthur. You should have researched better. Also, they're not a massive jelly. They are a massive solid muscle. Cephalopods. Marine biology student, by the way. Majored in invertebrate zoology. Cephalopods are bundles of muscle. They don't have bones like us. So we've got bones and we've got muscle and we've got tendons, and the whole thing has this pulley effect system based around the bone, which is why when you break a bone, you can't actually move the bits at the end. Cephalopods don't have that. What they have is opposing muscle. They have one layer of muscle that goes like that, another layer of muscle that goes like that, and that opposing muscle gives them the structure that we get from bones, muscles, and tendons. So calling a giant squid a mass of jelly insulted me deep in my cephalopod-loving heart. Arms, Clark, arms! They don't have effing tentacles to investigate their surrounds. A squid has got 8 arms and 2 tentacles. The tentacles are long and they use them for feeding and for mating, and they investigate things with their arms, which have the suckers on them. Okay, tentacles do have a couple of suckers on them at the end, but just read a marine biology book before you write a marine biology novel, hey? Okay, and regarding this giant squid, page 119, they are planning to bring a giant squid to the surface and keep it alive in a pen with no more protection than a shade cloth. I can feel my IQ dropping just reading this. And don't try to tell me that they didn't know better about pressure in the 1950s, because they did. A page or two earlier, Franklin's Little Woman explains that the squid in Moby Dick was probably dying because it was on the surface, and I've read accounts of scientists who were working in this era, and some of them were even women. Horror! Even some of them married women. Married women working at something other than washing their husband's clothes. Good gracious, but yes, they did. Some of them were allowed to continue their careers. I'm going to wave around Edith Windler's excellent book right now because that is marvellous. Marvellous book. Born in the 50s. Continued working as a marine biologist after she got married. Arthur C. Clarke. You could learn from that. Okay, sorry, I'll stop. But in the 50s, they knew what happened to deep sea animals when you birth them to the surface. They go pop. That squid did not go pop, and it should have. But yes, the married women who already knew. Which brings me to the misogyny. It was set in the 1950s, and that had to be my mantra throughout reading this book. I chanted 1950s, 1950s. I chanted that mantra a lot. Now, I'm usually the cool head in the group talking about an era in which a book was written. Early sci-fi, like early artwork, reflects the era in which it's made, not the era it is trying to depict. So, if you look at a Dutch portrait of King Solomon, you're going to be looking at a Dutchman. He's going to be dressed like a Dutchman in the era in which it was painted, not like King Solomon out of the Old Testament. Same with sci-fi. Arthur C. Clarke wrote this in the 50s. The Attitudes are 1950s. But that said, some authors in the 1920s to the 1970s could write genders, social customs, without being racist or misogynist, and here, or just plain icky. And Clarke here can't, because this is icky. One woman in the whole thing, for goodness sake. Oh, I was going to read this out, but I'm too annoyed. On pages 53 to 54, Indra, the incipient love interest to Franklin, takes him out on a cruise and a catamaran from Heron Island, and he reflects how useful it would be to have such an efficient woman around the house, until he remembers that efficient women run their husbands as well as the house. Pass me that bucket! Vomit! Vomit, I tell you! But the last paragraph of page 54 is pure ocean poetry. So it kept me strung along even while I was really angry at it. Okay, by page 117, an intelligent scientist with postdoc stays home because she needs to take care of hubby and progeny, and this was gut-wrenching. From ichthyologist, passionate ichthyologist, to unpaid housekeeper, Indra was deeply, deeply disappointing. But the thing that made this misogyny worse than disappointing but thoroughly icky is that Clarke depicts her as being perfectly happy with the situation. She's happy to have given up a career. Oh, she might take it up one day when the kids are old enough. No, she won't. You can't. It's too much to get back. It's clumsy, it's misogynistic, it's bigoted, it's 1950s. Oh, and there was an interesting little, this didn't annoy me as much, but on page 103, he talks about how a married couple argue less after having their first baby because their baby gives meaning to their life or whatever. And I'm not sure that reflects the reality of most of the people I know. Most of the people I know who have their first baby find that first year hellish. But of course, these days, men are expected to do part of the parenting as well as that woman. So maybe that's different. I don't know. So I've talked a lot about how much this book annoyed me. Essentially, I had problems with its core premise. It's not meant, I think, to be a dystopian book. I think it's meant to reflect a kind of utopia, a kind of futuristic, effective use of resources. It's not meant to be a dystopia, but to me, it reads more like that. So he's talking about a world that solved world hunger, but excuse me, a world where the Great Barrier Reef is the cash cow of the World Food Organization instead of being a marine reserve. This is my idea of post-apocalyptic. Lady Musgrave Island, for example. I love that island. It's beautiful. Instead of a small, sensitive eco-resort, in this future it is an industrial complex for generators, and the reef has been dynamited so that you can get boats through. I nearly wept. Heron Island, another weeping song. Clark lauds the preservation of natural forest of Pisonia trees on Heron, but later contradicts himself by describing the foul dock, the disgusting water, the blasting through the reef, the fact that that forest is only a tiny narrow band, so it's not a viable forest at all. Okay, Clark is exceptionally enamored with the notion that Don and the other wardens are recreating the vibes of the American settlers herding bisons across the plains of America. He harps on this theme repeatedly in the early 2 sections, apparently with a complete lack of awareness that this was a major eco-disaster. The bison herds are ecologically extinct, and I'm just surprised he doesn't praise the shooting the passenger pigeon into extinction. That's what they want for the orcas after all, so why not? Now, in the end, which I disliked, was part 3, the bureaucrat. So at this point, Don's been gotten rid of. We've only got Franklin. He's a bureaucrat high up in the whaling organisation. Actually, before that, I'm going to talk about the cover. The artwork is good, but the artwork is odd. See that big green thing? To me, this clearly looks like a sea hare. A sea hare is like, most people would think of it as a nudibranch, but it's actually a slightly different animal. It's still a mollusk. It's still a shellless mollusk. But that looks like someone picked an image of a sea hare out of a textbook, recreated with green and a little submarine down there, and shoved it on the cover. I think that's meant to be the giant squid that they brought up from the depths. It's a sea hare. Enough said. Okay, so part 3 is essentially the end of the whaling culture that Clark built up in the first 2 sections, because a Buddhist priest takes up against it because he doesn't think that killing off animals is great. And this Buddhist priest is important because apparently of all the religions around on earth, Buddhism is the only one to survive. That was really funny. That was really cute and really funny. I mean, I could almost wish for that, but no. That's on page 158 if you want to read it. I'm not going to read it aloud. The light's failing. I can't be bothered. So, but at this point, at this point, Franklin has a crisis of conscience about killing whales. And one has to ask oneself, was Clark building up the whole future merely to shock us? To present unexpectedly and so in the most visceral of ways how despicable killing whales really is? I wish I thought that, but I don't think so. Maybe it was his intention, but this book did not ever redeem itself for me because the proposed solution to whaling was worse than ecological collapse that was already taking place. It means keeping the whales as cows and milking them regularly. This might sound better to a vegan or to a Buddhist, but at the cost of wiping out the entire ocean to provide 12% of human food, I don't think so, because they've farmed the entire Pacific. They've turned it into a great sludge of tropical plankton. So nothing that we know of the Pacific of its beauty could possibly remain. And they're killing off all the sharks and orcas. And all the whales are basically meat on the hoof. To be honest, I found Make Room by Harry Harrison. The approach there to world hunger is spoilers. They're putting humans in the processes. I found that less appalling than this book, because at least in Make Room, Harry Harrison's future doesn't seem to pretend that this is a good outcome, and they're secretive about it. But in The Deep Range, they behave as if it's just fine to flesh whales. I doubt that Clark saw it this way. Another small problem I had with this book is that I never much liked Franklin, and I'm not sure that I was meant to, because in all the books by Clark I have read that I can remember, he always seems to make his main character a bit of a non-entity, as a vessel for the story rather than someone to really be involved in. He does write interesting, complex, vivid characters like Don, but they never seem to be the main character. They're always a side character. So while I never much liked Franklin, I never despised him, right until the end in The Bureaucrat, where a couple of weeks with the Buddhist made him suddenly go around to the point of view that killing whales is wrong. You've worked with them for, I think, nearly 2 decades by now, and hanging out with a Buddhist is what convinces you that your behavior is wrong? There's something wrong with you, dude. Seriously wrong with you. And that made his character actually quite despicable to me. So since I was already disenchanted with the book, a lot about the end did bother me. Would it have been more enjoyable to me if I'd enjoyed the rest of the book? And I'm not sure about that. I really can't imagine. But the end felt mawkish to me, an incredibly naive attitude to humane behaviour, where the monk takes the World Food Organization basically to an inquiry to see if it's justifiable to kill whales. I guess he's going to go for cows and sheep next, but whales first. For no very good reason. No very good reason. I'm totally on board with not killing whales. I'm against whaling. I promote what Sea Shepherd does. I agree with the whole anti-whaling, but the way it's done here is utterly mawkish and pathetically indefensible. He also has the notion that education would make people be informed voters, and that's hysterically funny to anyone on Earth today, I suspect, as is the notion that governments are held accountable by elections. Where did you get that idea, Clark? Surely even you can't believe that an election holds a government official accountable. It's just ludicrous. So, all in all, to sum up, this is a very, very 1950s sci-fi by Arthur C. Clarke, who's is considered these days to be one of the 3 greats with Asimov and Heinlein. I really, really didn't like this book. I hope I like Rendezvous with Rama, which I plan to reread this year, better than I like this one. It was wrong on so many levels. It was eco-terrorism and omnivorous readers' personal post-apocalyptic dystopia with no healthy oceans left in the entirety of the Pacific because we're too busy farming them for diatoms and killing whales and sharks and orcas in them. The writing was still beautiful. If you don't have a strong commitment to marine biology, this book may well be for you. If you love classic sci-fi from the 50s or you love Arthur C. Clarke, then I think that everything that bothered me about it will fail to impact on you. And you should definitely read it, because everyone should read classic sci-fi, right? But this book for me was one to read with a bucket on hand, pass the bucket so I could vomit regularly. Metaphorically speaking. Like, comment, subscribe. If you actually like this, did you notice any of the things that bothered me? Or is it just... It's not just me. I'm sure many marine biologists out there would be as upset, but maybe some would laugh at them. Anyway, comment. Tell me what you thought, please.